Ever since I was a kid, I loved to read, and I always spent any money I got on books. I was really happy with them. My first collection was John Bunyan's books, each in its own small volume. Later, I sold those books so I could buy R. Burton's. They were small, cheap books sold by traveling salesmen, about 40 or 50 of them in total. My dad's small library was mostly books about religious arguments, and I read most of them. I've often wished since then that when I was so eager to learn, I had found more suitable books, especially since it had been decided I wouldn't become a clergyman. There was Plutarch's, likely Lives, which I read a lot, and I still believe that time was very well spent. There was also a book by Defoe called Anne, and another by Dr. Mather called, which perhaps shaped my way of thinking and influenced some major events later in my life. Eventually, my love for books convinced my father to make me a printer, even though his other son, James, was already in that profession. In 1717, my brother James came back from England with a printing press and type to start his business in Boston. I liked it a lot more than my father's trade, but I still really wanted to go to sea. To stop me from acting on that desire, my father was eager to officially apprentice me to my brother. I resisted for a while, but eventually I was convinced and signed the apprenticeship papers when I was only 12 years old. I was supposed to be an apprentice until I turned 21, but I would get a skilled worker's pay during the last year. Soon I got really good at the business and became a big help to my brother. I now had access to better books. Knowing booksellers' apprentices sometimes allowed me to borrow a small book, which I made sure to return quickly and in good condition. Often I stayed up in my room reading most of the night, especially if I had borrowed the book in the evening and had to return it early the next morning, so it wouldn't be missed or needed by someone else. After a while, a clever businessman named Mr. Matthew Adams, who had a nice collection of books and often visited our print shop, noticed me. He invited me to his library and very kindly lent me any books I wanted to read. I became interested in poetry and wrote some small poems. My brother, thinking it might be profitable, encouraged me and had me write songs for special occasions. One was called The Lighthouse Tragedy, and was about Captain Wortherlake and his 2 daughters drowning. The other was a sailor's song about capturing missing name, likely Teach or Blackbeard, the pirate. They were terrible quality, like cheap, poorly written street songs. When they were printed, he sent me around town to sell them. The first one sold incredibly well because the event had just happened and everyone was talking about it. This made me feel proud, but my father put me down by making fun of my writing and telling me that poets usually ended up poor. So I avoided becoming a poet, and probably a very bad one at that. But since writing prose has been very helpful to me throughout my life and was a main reason for my success, I'll tell you how I managed to get what little skill I have in writing, given those circumstances. There was another boy in town who loved books, named John Collins, and we were very good friends. We often argued, and we loved debating and trying to prove each other wrong. By the way, this argumentative nature can easily become a very bad habit. It makes people really annoying in company because they always have to contradict others to practice it. And besides ruining conversations, it creates dislike and maybe even enemies where you might need friends. I picked up this habit from reading my father's books arguing about religion. I've noticed since then that sensible people rarely get into this habit, except for lawyers, university students, and anyone educated in Edinburgh. Collins and I once started discussing, somehow, whether women should be educated, and if they were capable of studying. He thought it was wrong, and that women weren't naturally suited for it. I argued the opposite, maybe just for the sake of arguing. He was naturally better at speaking, with lots of words at his disposal, and sometimes I felt he overwhelmed me more with how smoothly he spoke than with the actual strength of his arguments. Since we left without resolving the issue and wouldn't see each other again for a while, I sat down to write out my arguments, made a clean copy, and sent it to him. He wrote back, and I responded. We had exchanged 3 or 4 letters each when my father happened to find and read my papers. Without getting into the argument itself, he took the opportunity to talk to me about my writing style. He pointed out that even though I was better than my opponent at spelling and punctuation, which I learned from the print shop, I was really lacking in elegant language, organization, and clarity, and he showed me this with several examples. I realized his comments were fair, and from then on I paid more attention to how I wrote and decided to try to get better. Around this time, I found a single volume of The Spectator. It was the 3rd one, and I had never seen any of the others before. I bought it, read it many times, and really enjoyed it. I thought the writing was excellent and wanted to copy its style if I could. To do this, I took some of the articles and wrote down brief notes of the main idea in each sentence. I put them aside for a few days, and then, without looking at the book, I tried to rewrite the articles, fully expressing each idea I had noted as completely as it had been written originally, using any appropriate words I could think of. Then I compared my version with the original, found some of my mistakes, and fixed them. But I realized I didn't have enough words or wasn't quick enough at remembering and using them. I thought I would have developed this skill earlier if I had continued writing poetry, because constantly needing words with the same meaning but different lengths for rhythm or different sounds for rhyme would have forced me to always look for variety and would have helped me remember those words and master them. So I took some of the stories and rewrote them as poems, and after a while, when I had mostly forgotten the original prose, I turned them back into prose. I also sometimes mixed up my notes, and after a few weeks, I tried to organize them into the best possible order before I started writing full sentences and finishing the article. This was to teach me how to organize my thoughts. By comparing my work with the original afterward, I found many errors and fixed them. But sometimes I had the pleasant thought that in some minor ways I had actually managed to improve the writing style, and this encouraged me to think that I might eventually become a decent English writer, which I really wanted to be. I did these exercises and read at night, after work or before it started in the morning, or on Sundays when I managed to be alone in the print shop. I avoided, as much as possible, the regular church services my father made me attend when I lived with him, and which I still considered my duty, even though I felt I couldn't spare the time for it.
When I was about 16, I came across a book by someone named Tryon that suggested eating only vegetables. I decided to try it. My brother, who wasn't married yet, didn't have his own home but lived and ate with his apprentices at another family's house. My refusal to eat meat caused problems, and I was often scolded for being different. I learned how Tryon prepared some of his dishes, like boiling potatoes or rice, making hasty pudding, and a few others. Then I suggested to my brother that if he gave me half the money he paid for my food each week, I would buy my own food. He agreed right away, and I quickly realized I could save half of what he gave me. This gave me extra money for buying books. But there was another benefit too. While my brother and the others went from the print shop to eat, I stayed there alone. I quickly ate my light meal, which was often just a biscuit or a slice of bread, a handful of raisins or a pastry, and a glass of water. This gave me the rest of the time until they came back to study. I made better progress because of the clearer mind and quicker understanding that usually come with eating and drinking moderately. And then, after feeling embarrassed about how bad I was at math, which I had failed to learn twice in school, I got Cocker's arithmetic book and easily taught myself the whole thing. I also read Sellers and Shermy's navigation books and learned the bit of geometry they included. But I never went very deep into that subject. Around this time I also read Locke's and the By the Gentleman of Portroy.
While I was focused on improving my writing, I found an English grammar book, I think it was Greenwood's, which had 2 short summaries of rhetoric and logic at the end. The logic section ended with an example of an argument using the Socratic method. Soon after, I got Xenophon's Memorable Things of Socrates, which had many examples of this same method. I was fascinated by it, and I started using it. I stopped my blunt contradictions and forceful arguments, and instead acted like a humble questioner and someone who wasn't sure. And at that time, having become genuinely doubtful about many religious beliefs after reading Shaftesbury and Collins, I found this method safest for me and very awkward for those I used it against. So I enjoyed it, practiced it constantly, and became very skilled and clever at getting people, even those smarter than me, to agree to things they didn't realize the implications of, trapping them in problems they couldn't get out of, and winning arguments that neither I nor my position always deserved to win. I continued this method for a few years, but gradually stopped, keeping only the habit of speaking with modest uncertainty. When I suggested something that could be argued, I never used words like certainly or undoubtedly, or any others that make an opinion sound absolutely sure. Instead, I would say, I think or understand something to be this way, or it seems to me, or I imagine for these reasons, or I suppose, or I don't doubt. I believe this habit has been very helpful when I've needed to share my ideas and convince people to support causes I've been involved in. And since the main goals of conversation are to inform or be informed, persuade or be persuaded, I wish well-meaning, sensible people wouldn't reduce their ability to do good by using a confident, arrogant style that almost always annoys others, creates opposition, and defeats all the purposes for which we were given speech, which are to give or receive information or pleasure. Because if you want to share information, a confident and opinionated way of presenting your views might just make people argue back and stop them from listening openly. If you want to learn and improve from what others know, but at the same time you act like your current opinions are absolutely set, humble, sensible people who don't like arguing will probably just let you stick to your mistakes without challenging you. And by acting that way, you can rarely expect to impress your audience or convince those whose agreement you want. Pope wisely advises us, even if you're sure, speak with apparent uncertainty. And he could have paired with this line the one he paired with another, which I think was less fitting. Lacking modesty means lacking sense. If you ask why it's less fitting, I have to repeat the lines. Rude words can't be defended because lacking modesty means lacking sense. Now, isn't a lack of sense, when a man is unlucky enough to lack it, some excuse for his rudeness? And wouldn't the lines be more accurate if they were, rude words have this defense, that lacking modesty means lacking sense? However, I'll leave this for wiser people to decide. In 1720 or 1721, my brother started printing a newspaper. It was the second newspaper in America and was called the New England Courant. The only one before it was the Boston Newsletter. I remember some of his friends tried to talk him out of it, saying it probably wouldn't work because they thought one newspaper was enough for all of America. As of now, 1771, there are at least 25. He went ahead with the project anyway, and after I had set the type and printed the pages, I was sent to deliver the newspapers to customers throughout the town. He had some clever friends who enjoyed writing short articles for this newspaper, which gave it a good reputation and made it more popular. These gentlemen often visited us. Listening to their conversations and hearing how well their articles were received, I was eager to try writing something myself. But since I was still a boy and suspected my brother wouldn't want to print anything of mine in his paper if he knew it was for me, I managed to hide my handwriting, wrote an anonymous article, and slipped it under the print shop door at night. It was found in the morning and shared with his writer friends when they stopped by as usual. They read it and talked about it while I listened, and I had the immense pleasure of hearing them approve of it. As they guessed who the author was, they only named well-known, educated, and clever men from our group. I guess now that I was pretty lucky with who judged it, and that maybe they weren't as good judges as I thought they were back then. Encouraged by this, I wrote and submitted several more articles to the press in the same way, and they were also approved. I kept my secret until I had pretty much run out of ideas for such writings. Then I revealed it, when my brother's acquaintances started to pay a bit more attention to me, in a way that didn't quite please him, as he thought, probably rightly, that it made me too conceited. And perhaps this was one reason for the arguments we started having around that time. Even though he was my brother, he saw himself as my boss and me as his apprentice, and so he expected the same work from me as he would from any other apprentice. Meanwhile, I thought he treated me too poorly in some of the things he asked me to do, and from a brother I expected more leniency. Our arguments were often brought to our father, and I suspect I was usually right, or at least better at arguing my case, because the decisions usually went my way. But my brother had a bad temper and often hit me, which I really resented. And thinking my apprenticeship was very long and boring, I was always hoping for a chance to end it early, which finally came about in an unexpected way.
One of the articles in our newspaper, about some political issue I've now forgotten, offended the assembly, the local government. He was arrested, criticized, and jailed for a month, I assume by the speaker's order, because he wouldn't reveal who wrote the article. I was also arrested and questioned by the council, but even though I didn't give them any useful information, they were satisfied with just warning me and letting me go, perhaps because they saw me as an apprentice who was obligated to keep his master's secrets. While my brother was in jail, which I was quite upset about despite our personal disagreements, I was in charge of the newspaper. I dared to criticize our leaders in it, which my brother appreciated a lot, while others started to see me negatively, as a young talent who liked writing critical and satirical pieces.
My brother was released from jail with an order from the assembly, a very strange one. His friends held a meeting in our print shop to discuss what he should do. Some suggested getting around the order by changing the newspaper's name. But my brother saw problems with that, so they finally decided it would be better to print it in the future under the name of Ant, and to avoid the assembly's criticism, which might come if he was still printing it through his apprentice. The plan was for my old apprenticeship papers to be returned to me with a full release written on the back, to be shown if needed. But to ensure he still got my service, I was to sign new apprenticeship papers for the rest of my term, which would be kept secret. It was a very weak plan. However, it was put into action right away, and the newspaper continued under my name for several months. Eventually, a new argument came up between my brother and me, and I decided to declare myself free, assuming he wouldn't dare to show the secret new apprenticeship papers. It wasn't fair of me to take advantage of the situation, and I consider this one of the first mistakes of my life. But the unfairness didn't bother me much at the time, because I was so angry about the beatings his temper often led him to give me, even though he wasn't a bad-tempered person otherwise. Perhaps I was too disrespectful and annoying. When he realized I was going to leave him, he made sure I couldn't get a job at any other print shop in town by going around and talking to every owner, and they all refused to hire me. I then thought about going to New York, as it was the closest place with a printer. I was quite keen to leave Boston when I considered that I had already annoyed the ruling party a bit, and given the unfair actions of the assembly in my brother's situation, it was likely that if I stayed, I'd soon get into trouble. Furthermore, my careless arguments about religion were starting to make good people look at me with horror, thinking I was an infidel or atheist. I made up my mind, but with my father now supporting my brother, I knew that if I tried to leave openly, they would find ways to stop me. So my friend Collins agreed to help me out a bit. He arranged my trip with the captain of a New York boat, pretending I was a young friend of his. So I sold some of my books to get some money, was secretly taken onto the boat, and since we had good wind, in 3 days I was in New York, almost 300 miles from home. I was only 17, without any introductions or knowing anyone there, and with very little money in my pocket.